Welcome to Quick Stop F1. My name is Nasher and you could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us. We appreciate that. On today, a day that ends in a Y. And what does that mean? That means yes, Bernie Ecclestone has had something negative to say about Lewis Hamilton. And to be honest, I've been thinking about this and I feel like since I've started this podcast 4 years ago, something has come up from Bernie Ecclestone every fucking few months. And I just wanted to go through all of the things that Bernie Ecclestone has said and maybe find out what is it about Lewis Hamilton that irks Bernie Ecclestone so much. But before we get into that, remember, if you like this video, like this channel, if you're watching, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, all of them things there. And let's see what Mr. Ecclestone, our favourite elderly man, has had to say about Lewis Hamilton. Okay, well, look, I've gone searching on the internet, looking for basically articles from Bernie Ecclestone. And obviously, look, Bernie Ecclestone being Bernie Ecclestone, if you don't know, Bernie is essentially the godfather of F1. He is the man who took it from maybe not a provincial thing, but he basically owned and grew the sport pretty much into what we know today until it sailed to Liberty Media in 2017. And essentially, Bernie Ecclestone ruled with an iron fist. His way or the highway. To get an impression of what Bernie Ecclestone was like and how old school he was in his mentalities, Bernie Ecclestone, essentially F1 did not have any social media presence at all. Even at the point of sale in 2017, you couldn't see highlights, there was no social media clips. He was very much of the opinion that he wanted to market to rich white men because they're the ones who bought tickets. Not my words, his. I know people can get a bit sensitive around the word white, but he said that, not me. Okay? Just saying. But since he's left the sport, obviously, he's still a man of interest and he'll always have an opinion on things. One thing about Bernie, very opinionated. One thing he seems extremely opinionated on is Lewis Hamilton. And I'm just going to go through year by year, 2020, for the last 5 years, right? So from mid-2020 to 2025 right now, right? Let's go through some of the things that Bernie Ecclestone has said about Lewis Hamilton and see if there's a running theme of sorts. So in 2020, we are obviously in the middle or at the beginning of the pandemic, right? But also one of the things that we're in the middle of is a growing kind of swelling of discussions and conversations around civil rights, specifically around the way that black people are treated by the police, black people are treated in a lot of social areas, right? A sensitive subject, one that a lot of people kind of are very passionate about, and one person who became very passionate about it was Lewis Hamilton. Obviously, we saw him in that 2020 season almost take it aboard himself to start to try and talk about the lack of diversity in F1, not just on the grid, but up and down the grid in terms of drivers, but in terms of the staff who work, the engineers. How can we make it a more diverse sport? And out of that was born the Hamilton Commission, which was made to address and look at the lack of diversity in F1. And obviously, then you have Project 44, which is his charity arm aimed at making that better, right? But in mid-2020, let's give some background. F1 has been, they've tried to go to Australia. Clearly, they couldn't because COVID was rampant. They shut down immediately upon arriving in Melbourne. And obviously then Lewis went on, to go and talk about a lot of things, including Black Lives Matter. And in 2020, in a CNN interview, Bernie Ecclestone had this to say about Black Lives Matter and Lewis Hamilton's anti-racism efforts. In a lot of cases, black people are more racist than white people. Yeah. So Lewis Hamilton did actually respond to this. He called the post, the interview, ignorant and uneducated, and that was directly on his Instagram. And he actually said, if this is how the person who used to run F1 is how he thinks, imagine what it was like for me driving and working under those conditions, and it makes sense as to why none of the things that I wanted to kind of bring through, or why the racist abuse that I received, nothing was done about it. And in fairness to F1 themselves, they came out themselves and said that they explicitly distanced themselves from Bernie Ecclestone's comment, and they actually ended his honorary chairman title in January 2020, almost before all of these comments made. So they were very much saying that this guy has nothing to do with the business anymore. And this would be something in terms of race that we'll come back to later, because he definitely kind of uses that again in an incident that Hamilton is involved in. But the next year, he has more to say. So, 2021, ahead of the British Grand Prix, Bernie Ecclestone says Lewis Hamilton is no longer the fighter he once was, and actually said that, he was essentially, a diminished force. And look, I think Bernie Ecclestone has his right to that opinion. I don't think anyone's really, if that's what he believes, that's fine. I think, he also said he wanted Verstappen to win the title. Again, not really away from a lot of things that anyone had to say. But again, not really the most positive critique of essentially the greatest driver of all time within the sport. Hamilton, for what it's worth, at that point had to say, I'm not the driver I was, I am better. And he actually went on to win that race. What a day. What a day. The following year saw the Nelson Piquet controversy. Now, if you don't remember what happened with the Nelson Piquet controversy, essentially what happened was Nelson Piquet, an old interview surfaced of Nelson Piquet talking about Lewis Hamilton, and he used essentially a Brazilian Portuguese word for the N-word, essentially, and also implied that Hamilton was homosexual. So not only did we have racist remarks, we had homophobic remarks as well. Bernie Ecclestone went on Piers Morgan's show Uncensored and said that, Hamilton should have brushed aside the racist commentary said by Nelson Piquet, instead of, I guess, blowing it up by reacting to it. And he also essentially said that racist commentary is similar to making remarks about someone's physical appearance. I mean, yeah. So look, I think it's clear, right? Bernie Ecclestone is of a generation where it's more likely than not that they don't see racism as an issue, or even openly kind of hold views of white superiority over other races. This is how people like that would have grown up. You almost have, not that I say I have more sympathy, but you almost understand it more than you new plate racists who comment on our stuff and say racist things. I was like, you have all the tools in the world to not be racist, yet you still are, which is hilarious and pathetic. But again, with Bernie Ecclestone, I think it's quite clear that he didn't like the direction that Lewis was trying to take F1 with, the Black Lives Matter kneeling and the diversity talk, and almost saying, almost like it could be the fact that he feels Hamilton's almost tarnishing his legacy. And maybe that is what is causing these comments now. And yeah, essentially, it kind of goes on and on and on. Negative. Essentially, every time Bernie Ecclestone gets in front of a camera or gets in front of a microphone, he's making even more negative comments about Lewis Hamilton. In 2024, I think this is 2024. Bernie Ecclestone had this to say about Lewis Hamilton's dress code. So, talking about Lewis Hamilton and his dress sense and how Lewis came into Ferrari and all of the pictures of him in his suit and so forth, Bernie Ecclestone said, Lewis gets himself up front in a way where you can dislike him. How can a guy who has won a few world titles and has a few dollars in the bank dress the way he dresses? I'm not a fan of that. So again, these are nothing that Bernie Ecclestone is saying is like the worst thing in the world, but it just does feel pointed that every time he gets in front of a camera, in front of a microphone, just has to say something disrespectful or not essentially not really being a massive fan of Lewis Hamilton. Which brings us to where we are now, where before the Hungarian Grand Prix, Bernie Ecclestone said that Lewis should consider retirement, and he said that he'd actually replace him with Isaac Hadjar or Gabriel Bortoleto. And look, again, this is something that a lot of people are saying anyway. Is Bernie Ecclestone on his own in that sense? But I guess the more someone has to say negative things someone has to say about you, you start to wonder what is the motivation behind that. Bernie Ecclestone's on record saying that Lewis Hamilton's claims of racism in F1 are complete made up bullshit, which is just insane to suggest. And also, but I guess also, you also have to remember that, again, Bernie is entitled to his opinions, and to a lot of people, he means a lot. He is the godfather of the sport that we all watch. So a lot of people do respect his opinion and do want to hear from him. And to be honest, we can be in this bubble of Lewis Hamilton as much as we want, but there are people outside of that bubble who don't have a positive view of Lewis Hamilton. And what Bernie says is almost an echo of the things that they feel. God knows we know that by the way that people interact with this page whenever we talk about Lewis Hamilton. I guess for me, I don't know. I think the media, I don't blame Bernie Ecclestone for thinking the way he does. I think free speech means that you are able to say and you're able to do whatever you want. Obviously, freedom of speech doesn't mean freedom from consequences, but it still means that, Bernie Ecclestone has the right to his opinion and he has the right to voice it. I think for me, my issue comes from F1 media who deliberately ask Bernie Ecclestone knowing that he's going to say something negative about Lewis Hamilton because they know that drives clicks. They know that drives engagement. And I just think in a sport like F1, I never see anything like this in any other sport. I never see, and from both like the Bernie side and the media side, no one has a bad. Maradona, for all intents and purposes, was an absolute shit. Like, this guy was fucking sniffing 8 balls Monday to Thursday, and then Friday to Sunday he would train and be the greatest football player of all time. Failed drug tests. But then if you talk, even when he was alive, when people asked about Maradona, they would be complimentary. Even Cristiano Ronaldo has how much on his fucking docket in terms of potential rape cases and this, that, and the other. But you don't see people within the sport actively looking to kind of, I guess, tear him down and diminish him. I guess the closest I can think of at the moment, I guess in basketball, LeBron James and Stephen A. Smith, that whole thing that happened there. But overall, I think a lot of people get annoyed by how much LeBron James is revered in the media, right? But if you look at him, like Michael Jordan, how much you never really hear people talk about. When people talk about Michael Jordan and his failings, or Michael Jordan and his gambling, or his the way he treated his teammates, it's never done in a way that is like disrespectful. And I feel like F1 likes to disrespect Lewis Hamilton because they know that creates clicks. And I just think, for me, that's not. We talk about journalistic standards and so forth. Have we fallen so far from that the best way to utilize Bernie Ecclestone's time and his wisdom and his experience and all of that is, just ask this senile old man what he thinks of Lewis Hamilton. I don't know. Maybe I'm being sensitive. I don't know. What do you think in the comments? Let me know. I just thought I'd get that off. And let's see. But if you liked what you're watching, make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel as well. Let me know what you think. And remember, no matter what life throws at you, keep it on the black stuff. Until next time, take care.